In the winter of 1939, over 300,000 Soviet soldiers poured across the Finnish border, expecting a swift, triumphant march to Helsinki, and within weeks the frozen forests of Karelia had become a graveyard for entire divisions. The disaster unfolded under the direct gaze of Marshal Kliment Voroshilov, the People's Commissar of Defense, a man who had spent years assuring Stalin that the Red Army was the most formidable fighting force on the planet. So how did the largest standing army in the world, numbering over 5 million men by the late 1930s, stumble so catastrophically against a nation of fewer than 4 million people? And what did this humiliation reveal about the way Soviet soldiers were actually trained, broken, rebuilt, and sent to fight? The answer begins not in Finland but years earlier, inside dusty garrison halls and frozen training grounds, stretching from Leningrad to Vladivostok, where a military machine unlike any other in history was being constructed. The Soviet Union did not merely want an army. It wanted a new kind of soldier, one forged by ideology as much as by rifle drills, one whose obedience was absolute not because of tradition or honor but because of political conviction, and when conviction failed, terror. Understanding how the Red Army trained its soldiers means understanding a system where a recruit's body, mind, and soul were all considered raw material to be shaped by the state. And the methods used to do this shaping were at times brilliant, at times brutal, and at times so dysfunctional that they nearly cost the Soviet Union its existence. The story of Red Army training in the 20th century is really the story of three overlapping systems colliding: military professionalism, communist ideology, and Stalinist paranoia. Each one pulled the training apparatus in a different direction, and the tension between them defined every aspect of a Soviet soldier's experience, from the moment he received his conscription notice to the moment he either survived his service or didn't. To understand this, we need to start with the man who first tried to build a modern Soviet military training doctrine, and whose reward for doing so was a bullet in the back of the head. Marshal Mikhail Tukhachevsky was, by most accounts, the most innovative military mind the Soviet Union ever produced. A former Tsarist officer who embraced the Bolshevik cause, Tukhachevsky rose through the ranks of the Civil War, and by the early 1930s had become the chief architect of Soviet military modernization. He championed mechanized warfare, deep battle operations, and combined arms tactics years before the German Wehrmacht made Blitzkrieg famous. But Tukhachevsky also understood something equally important, that none of these doctrines mattered if the soldiers executing them were poorly trained. He pushed for realistic field exercises, professional officer education, and training regimes that prioritized initiative and independent thinking at the junior officer level. His vision was of an army that could think on its feet, adapt to battlefield chaos, and exploit opportunities without waiting for orders from Moscow. If you find this kind of deep investigation into Soviet military history compelling, and you want to understand the hidden mechanics behind the decisions that shaped the 20th century, consider subscribing to this channel. We dig into the archives so you don't have to, and there is much more to uncover. Now, back to Tukhachevsky, because what happened to him changed everything. In June 1937, Tukhachevsky was arrested, accused of being part of a vast military conspiracy against Stalin, tortured into a confession, and executed. His blood was literally found spattered on the pages of his signed confession, a detail revealed when Soviet archives were partially opened decades later. But Tukhachevsky was not the only one. The Great Purge of 1937 to 1938 tore through the Red Army's officer corps like a scythe through wheat. 3 of 5 marshals were executed. 13 of 15 Army commanders were eliminated. 50 of 57 corps commanders disappeared. 154 out of 186 division commanders were arrested, shot, or sent to the Gulag. In total, approximately 35,000 officers were purged, removed, imprisoned, or killed. This was not a surgical strike against traitors. This was the amputation of the Army's brain. The consequences for training were immediate and devastating. The men who had spent years developing sophisticated training programs, who understood how to run realistic exercises, who could teach junior officers to read a battlefield, were gone overnight. Their replacements were often younger, less experienced, and above all, terrified. The lesson of the purge was unmistakable. Initiative gets you killed, not on the battlefield, but in your own headquarters. The new generation of officers learned to do exactly what they were told, nothing more and nothing less, because any deviation from orders could be interpreted as sabotage, treason, or counter-revolutionary activity. A political commissar sat in every unit, watching, reporting, filing assessments that could end a career or a life. Training became rigid, formulaic, and detached from the realities of modern warfare. Drills were conducted by the book, but the book had been written by men who were now in mass graves outside Moscow, and nobody dared update it. This was the army that invaded Finland in November 1939. The Winter War exposed every fault line in the Soviet training system with merciless clarity. Soldiers arrived at the front wearing summer boots in temperatures reaching -40 degrees. Units advanced in dense columns along narrow roads, making themselves perfect targets for Finnish ski troops who appeared out of the forest, struck and vanished. Soviet soldiers had been trained to follow orders, but when their officers were killed, which happened with alarming frequency because Finnish snipers specifically targeted anyone who looked like they were in command, entire companies simply stopped. They didn't retreat, they didn't advance. They froze, sometimes literally. The Battle of Suomussalmi in December 1939 saw two full Soviet divisions, the 163rd and the 44th, effectively destroyed by a Finnish force a fraction of their size. The 44th Division was cut into isolated pockets along the Ryate Road, and when the survivors were finally overrun, the Finns found abandoned tanks, artillery pieces, and field kitchens still warm with uneaten food. The soldiers had been trained to operate as a mass, and when the mass was broken into fragments, each fragment had no idea what to do. Stalin was furious, but he was also, in his own ruthless way, a pragmatist. The Winter War killed approximately 126,000 Soviet soldiers and wounded nearly 270,000 more, and it demonstrated to the entire world, including a very attentive Adolf Hitler, that the Red Army was a hollow giant. Something had to change, and it had to change fast. What followed was one of the most intensive military reform efforts in modern history, compressed into the narrow window between the end of the Winter War in March 1940 and the German invasion of June 1941. But here is the critical paradox that defined everything. The reforms had to fix the problems caused by the purge without acknowledging that the purge had caused those problems, because acknowledging that would mean criticizing Stalin, and criticizing Stalin was suicide. The man tasked with threading this impossible needle was Semyon Timoshenko, who replaced Voroshilov as People's Commissar of Defense in May 1940. Timoshenko was a blunt, hard-driving Ukrainian cavalryman who had survived the purge partly through luck and partly through a reputation for being more soldier than politician. He immediately launched a sweeping overhaul of training standards. His orders were direct. Training had to become realistic. Live ammunition exercises were reintroduced, even though they resulted in casualties during training itself, casualties that Timoshenko considered an acceptable price for combat readiness. Physical conditioning standards were raised dramatically. Soldiers were expected to march 30 to 40 kilometers per day in full kit. Winter warfare training was expanded, with entire divisions conducting exercises in Siberian conditions. Timoshenko also pushed for more autonomy at the small unit level, encouraging platoon and company commanders to make tactical decisions without waiting for approval from above. But there was a limit to how far these reforms could go in 15 months, and that limit was defined by two immovable constraints. The first was scale. The Red Army was expanding at a staggering rate, growing from approximately 2 million men in 1939 to over 5 million by June 1941. Training infrastructure simply could not keep pace. New divisions were being formed faster than they could be equipped or properly trained. Many units existed on paper long before they existed in reality, and when they did finally assemble, they often had weeks rather than months to prepare. The second constraint was political. The commissar system remained intact. Officers still operated under the shadow of political surveillance, and Stalin himself continued to interfere in military matters with the confidence of a man who had never commanded a battalion in combat, but who believed his genius was universal. There is a detail that captures the absurdity of this situation perfectly. In the months before the German invasion, Soviet intelligence received over 80 separate warnings that an attack was imminent. Military commanders along the western border requested permission to mobilize, to move units into defensive positions, to prepare fortifications. Stalin refused. He believed the warnings were British provocations designed to drag the Soviet Union into war prematurely. Any commander who pressed too hard for mobilization risked being accused of warmongering, or worse, of provoking the very conflict they were trying to prepare for. So the army trained, but it trained under the assumption that war was not coming yet, that there would be more time, that the political situation would be managed from above. This assumption was shattered at 3:15 in the morning on June 22, 1941, when 3 million German soldiers crossed the Soviet border along a front stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea. The opening months of Operation Barbarossa were a catastrophe of almost incomprehensible scale. In the first 18 days alone, the Wehrmacht advanced 300 miles into Soviet territory. Entire army groups were encircled and destroyed. The Battle of Kiev in September 1941 resulted in approximately 660,000 Soviet soldiers captured, the largest encirclement in the history of warfare. By November, the Germans were within 20 miles of Moscow. The Red Army had lost roughly 4 million soldiers killed, wounded, or captured in less than 6 months. The training system that had been painstakingly reformed under Timoshenko was rendered almost irrelevant because the units it had produced were being destroyed faster than new ones could be created. The Soviet Union was staring into the abyss. And yet, the abyss stared back and blinked first. What happened next is one of the most remarkable stories of military adaptation in human history, and it reveals something essential about how the Soviet training system actually functioned under existential pressure. The answer was not elegance, it was not sophistication. It was mass, speed, brutality, and an almost inhuman willingness to learn through dying. The wartime training system that emerged in late 1941 and early 1942 was built on a simple principle: get soldiers to the front as fast as possible and let the survivors teach the replacements. Training cycles that had been measured in months were compressed to weeks. Infantry replacements received as little as 2 to 4 weeks of basic training before being shipped to the front. They learned to fire a rifle, throw a grenade, dig a trench, and obey orders. Everything else they learned in combat, or they didn't learn at all. The mortality rate for these hastily trained replacements was staggering. Declassified Soviet records suggest that the average life expectancy of a replacement soldier arriving at the Stalingrad front in late 1942 was approximately 24 hours. This was not training in any conventional sense. This was natural selection conducted with rifles and artillery. But within this apparent chaos, there was a method, and it was more deliberate than it appeared from the outside. Soviet military planners understood that they could not train every soldier to the same standard. Instead, they concentrated their training resources on 2 categories: elite units and specialists. Guard divisions, which earned their designation through exceptional combat performance, received better equipment, more experienced officers, longer training cycles, and preferential treatment in everything from rations to leave. These units became the spearheads of major offensives, and their training reflected it. Meanwhile, specialist schools for snipers, sappers, tank crews, radio operators, and artillery gunners operated on accelerated but intensive curricula that produced technically competent soldiers in specific roles. The famous Soviet sniper schools, which produced marksmen like Vasily Zaitsev and Lyudmila Pavlichenko, were models of focused, efficient training. Zaitsev, a shepherd from the Ural Mountains, was trained as a clerk before the war, but was identified as a natural marksman and channeled into sniper training that emphasized patience, fieldcraft, and psychological resilience. Pavlichenko, one of the most lethal snipers in history with 309 confirmed kills, had been a competitive shooter before the war and was sent through an abbreviated officer training program that leveraged her existing skills. This 2-tier system, elite specialists trained intensively and mass infantry trained minimally, was not ideal, but it was functional under the circumstances, and it was complemented by something that no Western army practiced to the same degree: the systematic extraction and dissemination of combat lessons. The Soviet General Staff maintained an elaborate system for collecting after-action reports, analyzing tactical failures and successes, and distributing the findings to training commands across the entire front. These reports were blunt, detailed, and often horrifying in their candor. They described exactly how units had been destroyed, what mistakes commanders had made, and what tactics the Germans were using. Training programs were updated accordingly, sometimes on a weekly basis. A division training in the Urals in 1943 was receiving instruction based on lessons learned from battles fought just weeks earlier on the Kursk salient. This feedback loop was imperfect, slow, and often filtered through political considerations, but it existed, and over time it made the Red Army measurably more effective. There is an ironic twist in this story that deserves attention. The very quality that had made the pre-war training system so dysfunctional, its rigid top-down control, became an asset in wartime when it was redirected toward a useful purpose. The Soviet system was extraordinarily good at centralizing information and issuing uniform directives. When that capacity was used to enforce political orthodoxy on terrified officers, it was destructive. When it was used to push updated tactical guidance to hundreds of training camps simultaneously, it was powerful. The system didn't change, its application did. By 1943, the cumulative effect of these reforms, the hard lessons of 2 years of catastrophic warfare, and the sheer volume of combat experience filtering back into the training pipeline began to produce a qualitatively different Red Army. The soldiers who fought at Kursk in July 1943 were not the same soldiers who had been encircled at Kiev in 1941. They were harder, more experienced, and better led. The officer corps had been rebuilt, not through purges and promotions based on political loyalty, but through the most brutal meritocracy imaginable, survival. Officers who made fatal mistakes died along with their men. Officers who adapted, improvised, and learned from the enemy survived and were promoted. By mid-1943, the average Soviet division commander had more direct combat experience than his German counterpart, simply because the intensity and continuity of Soviet combat operations meant that anyone still alive and in command had been tested far beyond normal human limits. Physical training standards throughout the war remained grueling by any measure. Soviet infantrymen were expected to march enormous distances, often covering 30 to 50 kilometers per day during offensive operations, carrying full equipment weighing upwards of 30 kilograms. Rations were sparse, especially in the early years. Soldiers subsisted on black bread, kasha, thin soup, and whatever they could scavenge. The physical hardship of training in garrison life was itself a form of preparation for the deprivations of combat. There was no soft transition from peacetime comfort to wartime austerity, because peacetime was never comfortable to begin with. A Soviet conscript from a collective farm in Ukraine or a factory in Sverdlovsk arrived at his training depot already accustomed to hunger, cold, hard labor, and obedience to authority. The training system did not need to toughen him, it needed to channel the toughness he already possessed. Political training remained a constant throughout the entire Soviet military experience, from the Civil War through the Cold War. Every soldier received regular sessions of political education, conducted by the unit's political officer or zampolit. These sessions covered Marxist-Leninist theory, the history of the Communist Party, the crimes of fascism, and the glories of the Soviet state. During the war, political training took on a visceral, personal dimension. Soldiers were shown photographs of German atrocities, read letters from civilians in occupied territories, and told in explicit detail what the enemy had done to their countrymen. This was not abstract ideology. This was weaponized grief and rage, and it was extraordinarily effective at motivating soldiers to fight with a ferocity that often stunned their opponents. German military intelligence reports from the Eastern Front repeatedly noted the fanatical resistance of Soviet troops, a quality that owed as much to political conditioning as to personal courage. But political training had a darker function as well, one that operated through fear rather than inspiration. The infamous Order No. 227, issued by Stalin in July 1942, and known colloquially as "Not One Step Back," authorized the creation of penal battalions and blocking detachments. Penal battalions were composed of soldiers and officers who had committed disciplinary offenses, displayed cowardice, or retreated without authorization. They were assigned the most dangerous missions, essentially sent to redeem themselves through blood or die trying. Blocking detachments, usually composed of NKVD troops, were positioned behind frontline units with orders to shoot anyone who retreated without permission. The historical record on how frequently blocking detachments actually opened fire on their own soldiers is debated. Soviet archives released after 1991 suggest that between August and October 1942, blocking detachments detained approximately 140,000 soldiers, of whom roughly 1,000 were shot and the rest returned to their units or reassigned to penal battalions. Whether the primary function of blocking detachments was actual enforcement or psychological deterrence, the effect on training culture was unmistakable. Soldiers were trained to understand that retreat was not an option, that the enemy behind them could be as deadly as the enemy in front. The post-war Soviet military carried forward many of these wartime lessons, but the training system that emerged in the 1950s, 1960s, and 1970s was shaped by a new set of pressures: the nuclear age, the Cold War, and the institutional interests of a massive peacetime military bureaucracy. Conscription remained universal. Every Soviet male was required to serve 2 years in the army or 3 years in the navy. The conscription system drew young men from every corner of the Soviet Union, from the Baltic republics to Central Asia, from Siberian villages to Moscow apartments. This diversity created its own training challenges, particularly linguistic ones. Not all conscripts spoke fluent Russian, and training materials were overwhelmingly in Russian. Soldiers from Central Asian or Caucasian republics frequently arrived at their units with limited comprehension of their drill instructors' commands, a problem that was managed through a combination of patient repetition, buddy systems pairing Russian speakers with non-speakers, and, less admirably, widespread hazing and ethnic bullying. This brings us to what is perhaps the most notorious aspect of Soviet military training in the Cold War era, dedovshchina. The word translates roughly as rule of the grandfathers and refers to a deeply entrenched system of hazing in which senior conscripts, those in their second year of service, subjected junior conscripts to systematic physical and psychological abuse. Dedovshchina was not an occasional hazing incident. It was an institutionalized parallel hierarchy that operated alongside, and sometimes in defiance of the official chain of command. Junior soldiers were beaten, humiliated, forced to perform menial labor for senior conscripts, deprived of food and sleep, and in extreme cases subjected to violence that resulted in permanent injury or death. Soviet military records, supplemented by testimonies collected after the collapse of the Soviet Union, suggest that hundreds of soldiers died annually from hazing-related violence or suicide during the 1970s and 1980s. The military leadership was aware of the problem but largely tolerated it, partly because it served as an informal disciplinary mechanism that reduced the workload on officers, and partly because addressing it openly would have required admitting a systemic failure that reflected poorly on the entire Soviet military establishment. Dedovshchina had a direct impact on training quality. Junior conscripts who spent their first year being terrorized by senior soldiers were not focused on learning military skills. They were focused on surviving their own barracks. By the time they became senior conscripts themselves and the hazing shifted from being received to being administered, their technical training had been diluted by months of institutional dysfunction. The result was a conscript force that was, by many Western assessments, physically tough but tactically mediocre, capable of enduring enormous hardship but poorly prepared for the demands of modern combined arms warfare. This assessment was partially confirmed by the Soviet experience in Afghanistan, where conscript units frequently struggled against mujahideen fighters who were far less disciplined but far more adaptable and motivated. The Soviet-Afghan War, which lasted from 1979 to 1989, became the final crucible for Red Army training methods. Units deployed to Afghanistan discovered that their training, which still emphasized large-scale conventional operations on the European plain, was almost useless in the mountains and valleys of Central Asia. Soldiers trained to fight in tank formations found themselves patrolling narrow defiles where a single RPG could destroy an entire armored column. Training adapted on the fly, much as it had during the Second World War, with experienced units developing counter-insurgency techniques that were passed back to training commands in the Soviet Union. Special Forces units, particularly the Spetsnaz and airborne VDV divisions, received enhanced training for mountain warfare, helicopter operations, and small unit tactics. These elite formations performed effectively in Afghanistan, but the mass of the conscript army continued to struggle, hampered by the same problems that had plagued Soviet training for decades: rigid hierarchy, political interference, poor small unit leadership, and the corrosive effects of dedovshchina. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, it left behind a military training legacy that was as contradictory as the state that created it. At its best, the Soviet system produced soldiers of extraordinary resilience, technical specialists of genuine skill, and elite units that ranked among the finest in the world. At its worst, it produced traumatized conscripts, terrorized officers, and formations that crumbled when confronted with situations their training had not anticipated. The thread running through the entire story, from Tukhachevsky's execution to the barracks of the 1980s, is a single tension that was never resolved. The Soviet state needed soldiers who could think, adapt, and act independently, but it was built on a political system that punished independent thought at every level. Every reform that tried to encourage tactical initiative ran headlong into a political culture that demanded obedience, conformity, and submission to authority. The Red Army trained its soldiers the way the Soviet Union governed its people, with a mixture of genuine ambition, ideological fervor, institutional inertia, and a readiness to sacrifice the individual for the survival of the system. The soldiers who endured this system did not merely train. They survived it. And the difference between those two things explains more about the Soviet military experience than any doctrine manual ever could.